So as we read through that, what are some challenges or some tensions that you see in the text? John?
It's almost like Christ uses this evil guise and says, be like it.
Yep.
And so that's the confusing part. He sort of looks at this evil guy and another evil guy and says, hey, these two evil guys, you Christians, be even like them and learn from them.
Yep.
So that's sort of the contention there.
Yep. So Jesus is using an example of an unrighteous person. So Jesus, he does not commend the person. So he's actually almost in one respect praising him or saying, yeah, look at that. Some other tensions.
Maybe you could say like the whole issue of money, is that a tension here, like is money wrong or right? And we get a bit of an insight into that as we go through.
Yep.
Money in itself is not unrighteous, it's just how people get it and what they do and lie to each other and all those sort of things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's not money that's bad, but there are some other implications we'll get out of this. Anything else? Well, what about in the first instance? So he's called to give an account, is going to be fired, yet at the end of the story, the master's actually praising him for his shrewdness. So he's been shrewd with what he's done. He's going to lose his job, but at the end of it, he's actually praised. Do we actually see that happening in the real world? So in order to understand this, really what we want to work through is this. Is Jesus actually saying that we should employ dodgy practices to gain and use money for kingdom use and kingdom principles? It'd be very easy to reach that conclusion, but that's not really what Jesus is saying. So in order to work through that, what we're going to look at is 4 keys to understanding the parable and then the 4 implications as to what that actually means. Now, if we just think about that in an everyday context, we've got a wealthy guy, he's running a business of sorts, and he's busy, or maybe he's just off doing pleasurable things, and he puts a manager in place to look after the business. And so this manager is taking care of everything. He's looking after the stock, the buying, the selling, all the financial affairs. But then what we see is that word is getting back to the manager that things aren't as expected. So the first key that we're going to look at is really the window of opportunity that this guy has. Okay, so looking at that particular passage, he's now called to give an account. What is it that we see there what's the charge being brought against him? He's wasting his possessions. Is he guilty? How do we know that?
Because he makes a plan.
He makes a plan? Yeah?
And he says that I'm deprived of being, so he's been using his wealth and enjoying his wealth. He can't lower his status down to that level.
Yep. Yeah, so a few things there. So he's guilty. He doesn't actually give a defence. He doesn't argue the point. He doesn't make excuses. He doesn't beg for his job. He starts to plan. So what we've got here is he creates a window of opportunity for himself. He's not fired yet. He's being called to give an account. He's got to bring the books and the ledgers to the manager so he can present everything before he's out the door. In a way, it's like how we do business today. If you're going to leave a job, you hand in your notice, you serve out maybe 4 weeks, and then you move on. But what happens though, if you're running a business and you've got one of your employees is doing some questionable, potentially illegal things, are you really going to let them stick around? I know I've done that as a manager before. I actually had to fire someone, send them packing that day. And when they're not going to serve out their notice, are you really going to keep somebody dishonest running in your business, causing further damage? It doesn't make good business sense to do that in this instance. But this guy's given a window of opportunity. So he's got to collect the books, he's got to present them to the master before he's out on his ear. But he uses this window of opportunity to his advantage. Because as we see here, as John just mentioned, he's too proud to beg, but he's also too weak. He doesn't want to become a labourer. So he's now setting himself up so that when the time comes that he is out on his ear, that as he says here, the plan is that people may receive me into their homes. So he wants to do something to ingratiate the people to himself so that once his job is gone, they will need to receive him. So he puts this plan into effect. So he's going to use that time wisely. The next key that we need to understand is the debt reduction here. So he does something with the money that all these people owe to the manager. So as we read there in the text, so he goes out there and calls all the debtors one by one, and they all owe something. But as we see here, some very heavy discounting is going on. How do we actually understand that? Is he doing a good thing? Is he doing a dodgy thing? As we learn, it's a very shrewd thing that he's doing. So it just helps to understand a little bit around what's going on here. Is he discounting based on a profit margin, or is he shortchanging and cutting money away from the master? Interestingly there, so if you actually look at your notes, we've got a reference there to Deuteronomy 23, 19 to 20. And this is actually one of the laws that deals with how one should actually charge interest or not charge interest to a brother. The reference there, you shall not charge interest on loans to your brother, interest on money, interest on food, interest on anything that is lent for interest. You may charge a foreigner interest, but you may not charge your brother interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all that you undertake in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. So we have a very clear implication here that they're not allowed to charge interest. Do you think that would stop some people? You know, they want to find anything that they can do to work around the law. And there are all sorts of different interpretations that people have brought to this over the years. Like, for example, in one instance, if we actually take the two examples here, let's say that we've got an amount of oil and an amount of wheat that is owed to the master. Now, we don't know what the nature of the transaction was. Perhaps it's on loan or it's in exchange for something. Maybe those people are actually farming the land, and as payment for use of the land, they're actually going to pay in some goods. So whether something's been lent or not, maybe they are or aren't charging interest and artificially inflating the prices of whatever it is that's actually been sold. But what's actually happened here, if we take that, for example, that things have been inflated, what he does is he goes now to the first person and he says, how much do you owe my master? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And then the second one is 100 measures of wheat. And he'll get them now to quickly rewrite the bill to reduce the amount. So what's going on here? Is he heavily discounting and eating into the master's profits, or what's going on? Now, interestingly too, there's been some archaeological and historical evidence to indicate that what they would do is work around this, that in a business context, they could inflate the prices. So this is just one theory of several. In which case, though, what they've actually found through that evidence is that in the case of things like oil, what they could do is sometimes artificially inflate that by as much as 50 to 100% markup. Whereas for wheat, what they might be able to do is something in the order of 25 to 33% markup. So in which case then, if it is in exchange for land or something else, and they've set that price, clearly that contravenes what God's word says, but maybe they're doing something questionable themselves. So if on the one hand, what the master's doing is actually discounting, in effect, that amount, then essentially whatever it was that it's actually worth, there's actually nothing dodgy going on. He's just removing something that shouldn't have been there in the first place. Or if we ignore that scenario and just simply take it on face value, that this is what the master's charging, he's still discounted and eating into the profit somehow. Okay, so it's a bit hard to understand. Yeah, John.
It's a question in regards to that profit margin thing you're talking about.
Yeah.
So if he discounted it, does it mean they would have paid back quicker?
That's one possibility.
Yeah, so that the big master, the big boss, would have got stuff back quicker.
His money sooner.
Getting a larger amount later.
That's right. So what we actually look at, there's potentially a win-win-win situation here. So if we use the discount or the manager now, if that's his margin, he's not going to see that money anyway. So what he's going to do is use potentially what's owed to him. He's not going to see it, but maybe buy for himself some favour with friends. We'll look at that in a minute. But then from the master's perspective too, maybe he is being shortchanged, but as John just suggested, he may be getting his money sooner. So in one respect, he might also win. And also, that actually puts him in a good light with his debtors. They're going to look favourably upon him. So potentially, everybody wins out of this scenario. But what we get to is there's also mentioned as being dishonest. That's still the charge that's brought against him. So we're not really 100% sure what's going on. But another interesting thing we see in there too is by getting these people that owe the money to rewrite the IOUs, he's in effect making them also partners in crime. So in some respect too, he's got the dirty on them. So he's buying a way for himself to be set up then once he's out of a job. So there's this interesting thing around this whole debt reduction. But the question is this parable about ethical business principles? No. Okay, so we can move on. It's interesting to look at, but that's not really the point of the parable. What we're moving towards is the third area, is what he's doing is he is looking at winning favour with friends. So when he leaves this particular position, he's now going to be welcomed into people's homes. So let's take a look at verse 8 there. So is the manager there commending him for his dishonesty or his shrewdness? His shrewdness. Yep. He's actually marked as being dishonest. So it's clearly things aren't as they are expected to be, but he's being commended there for his shrewdness. Now, is shrewdness a negative or a positive thing?
Could be either.
Could be either? Yeah? How so?
So, for example, like in the Proverbs, being shrewd, it can be seen in a positive light in terms of being wise with your possessions or wise with your money. It could also be in a negative light in terms of being stingy or not wanting to give, just keeping everything to yourself.
Yep. Yep. Any other thoughts? Was that a good summary? It's a pretty fair assumption that in this instance too, it's being spun in a positive light. Whilst he's a dishonest person, he's being shrewd and crafty because he's setting something up for himself. So it does have that positive spin. But what's the reason that the manager did this? Peek back at verse 4. That when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their houses. So he's now set himself up for what Jesus is going to illustrate here now is, this is the point of the parable. Okay, this is the highlight. So Jesus has set a fictional set of characters and a story to now drive this principle home. If we read there in the second half of verse 8, he says, for the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation or their own kind than the sons of light. So what does that mean? So we're seeing a comparison that Jesus is now making between the sons of this world and the sons of light. Who do these two groups of people refer to? Who would be the sons of this world?
Anyone that's lost.
Anyone that's lost. And the sons of light? Easy distinction. Okay, so we've got this word. So depending on your translation, you'll see that this generation or this kind. It's talking about those of a particular group or a class. So a kind, like for like. So Christians, how do we deal with each other? Are we dealing with each other with a measure of shrewdness or care or thought? And is that anything like how the world treats each other as well? Because what Jesus is essentially indicating is that they're probably going to be looking after each other in their own interests, sometimes more than what we actually see those that are in the kingdom of God. So now we're starting to get a little bit uncomfortable with where Jesus is going with this. But if you think about that, when you look at people in the world, when it comes to dealing with their own interests, their own money, their own possessions, how crafty do you think people are going to be? Extremely. People are almost going to do anything that they can, or at least anything they can get away with, to either create money, to look after it, to do anything that's going to better their own position. And so they're looking at this very carefully. But if we focus on ourselves here then, if Jesus is pointing the finger at us, are we doing the same? Not in a dishonest way, but how much care do we take now for looking after our own resources and using those for the benefit of each other and also for use within God's kingdom? To give him glory, for him to actually get the benefit and his kingdom to get the benefit from that. Because moving into verse 9 here, we see Jesus saying, what are those three words it opens with? and I tell you. So he's now pointing to us. It's like Jesus in the room. Ignore me. Let's say Jesus is standing here. He's saying to them, now, I tell you. Okay, everybody sits up straight. What's he saying? Let's pay attention. Now I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. Now, so unrighteous wealth, what does that mean? Now, if you look at the Old English, like if you've got, I think you've got a King James or Authorised or something there, do you have mammon in your translation? Yeah. It's an Old English word. It's actually an alliteration. It's actually coming from the original language. It's an Aramaic term that doesn't necessarily mean only money, but it can also mean possessions. So it could be looking at money, possessions, anything that somebody owns or has at their disposal. But what is this unrighteous? Or some translations will say worldly wealth. Now, perhaps the word worldly there is maybe a little bit weak in terms of what it's actually saying. It's not just worldly, but he's actually using a point of it's unrighteous wealth. It's not that money itself is a bad thing, but as we know, the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It's the motivations and the things that come from inappropriately placed value in terms of money and possessions that lead us to do anything it takes to protect those possessions, rather than recognising those possessions really for what they are, as resources and tools that God's given to us. So unrighteous wealth is looking at, though, how are we actually using the money and the possessions that we're given? What does Jesus next say? So that if it fails? If or when? What does that mean? When it fails? When you die.
Yeah, you can't take it with you.
Yeah. Yep. But the money, the resources, they're not going to last forever. If you think about the parable of the rich fool, he's built bigger barns, he's amassed all this wealth, and then tonight your life is required of you. Somebody else gets to spend the money. Just helps to set our thinking a little bit that when it fails, this life is going to end one day and we can't take those possessions with us. Now we get to something interesting. Jesus says that they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So who's the they? Let's think about that for a minute. The they could be also related to then the friends, making friends for yourself by means of worldly wealth, so that they may receive you into eternal dwellings. And people have postulated as to whether that could mean angels or people that have gone ahead of us into heaven, etc. It could potentially mean a number of things, but what Jesus is doing is painting a picture is that after this life, have we used our time, our resources and our money to the benefit of eternity so that when we go into heaven, there's something to really show for it. We're not necessarily going to use money and possessions to buy people into heaven, but how are we using those as tools? Because what we need to understand is that everything that we've got are really resources that God has given us that are going to have eternal consequences. So having looked at those 4 keys, let's now look at the 4 implications as to what that really means for us today, how we need to reset our thinking. Because in one respect, what Jesus is essentially saying is that we are like this unrighteous manager. Not that we need to go around doing unrighteous and dodgy things, but there are a few key things to look at. The first one is time. We are on notice. This life is temporary. One day, we're going to pass from this life and we're going to be standing before the judgment seat of Christ, having to give an account for everything that we've done. We're on notice. Philippians 3:20 says that our citizenship is in heaven. Think about it like this. If tomorrow you received a letter to say that your Australian citizenship was revoked, you are now a citizenship of the United States. Everything you've got here is no longer yours. And you're going to be deported in 6 months' time. What are you going to do? So nothing there is really within your control. You're not a citizen of this country. You're going to the US in 6 months. The resources you have aren't your own. You're on notice. So you've got to do something and you're going to have to give an account because obviously you've got to get your passport ready or whatever it is you're going to be migrating. Because that leads us to the second point is then the resources. Everything that you've got now, you can't take it with you. Really, you're just going to take the clothes that are on your back, you're going to be deported. So what are you going to do? Potentially, are we going to then liquidate those resources? You can't take it with us. Do we give it away? Do we share that with others? Because the question is this: if you even look at your lives now, are the resources that you've got, the house that you own, the cars you drive, the money that's in your bank account, is it really yours? You know, in the natural sense, we can say, yeah, it's mine. I worked hard for that. But then we've got this whole concept of, well, hang on, did God give it to us? Is God blessed us with these things? Because you know how easy it is. You know, it's really easy to say that, oh yeah, all of these things is God. He's given it to me to be a good steward of. But deep down, do we really think that? Or do we just pay lip service to it? Because we want to protect the money. Do we really use those resources to share with others for the benefit of the kingdom? Because if we use that analogy of being deported, those resources aren't ours. So we've got to do something with that. So what do we do with the time and the resources that are available to us? And that's where we look at this concept of investment. How do we use the resources that are given to us, that are at our disposal, for eternal benefit? Using that scenario again, do we just sell all our possessions and now we've got cash? We can't take any of that with us. So what if in that scenario we actually start giving that to people that are going ahead of us, and maybe when we're there, they're going to receive us into their homes, they're going to help us get settled, get set up with a job. I know it's probably a weak example from this particular text, but it just helps illustrate the point that those resources that we have, they're at our disposal now, but we technically don't really own them. What are we doing now for the benefit of God's kingdom? Are we using the earthly resources given to us for eternal benefit? Because if we look back at verse 4, that this particular manager was wanting to be welcomed into people's earthly homes. These are temporary homes, versus Jesus makes the point in verse 9 that we're looking at heavenly or eternal dwellings. And really, this is the test. Whoops. Would help if I could draw straight. So this is the point. Is what Jesus is saying, is calling us to action here, to be thinking about that one day we're going to be called to give an account. If you read 1 Corinthians chapter 3, that one day we're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and everything that we've done in this life will be tested. Will it be burned up, or will it pass through and be translated into reward? A measure of faithfulness in this life is going to be measured as reward in the next. Are we going to be proven responsible? Would somebody like to read for us again, please, verses 10 to 12?
Whoever can be trusted with very little can be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? Keep going?
Yeah, just verse 12 too, thanks.
And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own?
So what's Jesus saying there?
It's talking about money, but then it's clear that if you're wise and generous and do things to please God, He will bless you with more resources.
Mm-hmm. In this life or the next?
Possibly both.
Yeah, both. Really.
Possibly both.
Really.
Yeah.
It's not guaranteed, but the life become guaranteed. But for this life, maybe God does bless you.
Yep. Yeah, what we don't want to do is turn this into a prosperity preaching set of verses that we say, yeah, because I did these things, I was faithful in that, God's going to give me more wealth and riches now. But He may bless us now, He may in the life to come. Any other thoughts?
Just on that, just notice verse 11, if you've not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, if we get this right, that is the wealth we have. Who will entrust you with true riches? So
Yes.
if really is, it would seem to be spiritual, not necessarily physical, because he calls that unrighteous wealth that we have and are entrusted with, but then he gives us the true riches. Would that be a fair?
Precisely.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean, and also unrighteous wealth, which means the wealth of this world.
Not unrighteous per se, as it is, can be used
Well,
unrighteously, yeah,
Well, but I mean, it does show you something about your spiritual life.
Yes.
How you spend those things tells you about what you love.
Hmm.
And that's the link he's making in verse 11. If you've not been faithful in the stuff that God's given you, who will entrust you with true riches? It doesn't show what's really going on in the inside of your heart. You can say you love God, but if you spend none of your wealth on God and His kingdom,
Yeah.
you clearly don't love God.
Yeah.
So there's parallels with the parable of the talents. So it's investment in the future
Yes.
and responsibility. And the shrewdness was because he was commended because he's thinking about his future, thinking about the future, not just going on like nothing's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
There was a teaching many years ago. The only two things, because this is an eternal context, the only two things that are eternal is the word of God and the hearts of men, or something was the wording. So taking the broader context, I've got, sitting at my place, I've got, I'll call them 3 talents, nuggets, kids, 3 kids. So how am I going with that investment? That possession. It's a crude way of putting it, but how am I going with Alex, Daniel, Eloise?
Yeah.
How am I hitting the money there? Is the investment my time, what are these items?
Time.
Yeah. What's the opportunity? There's a whole lot of, just to go back to last week, and you started with it, how am I looking at this?
Mm-hmm.
Because I find automatically, when I read these parables, I'm going to cash, cold cash. Whereas I don't think that's what this is saying. This is talking about pride and politics and dishonesty.
Mm-hmm.
So how am I going with Eloise? That possession. Is she possession? Feels like it. Yeah. So yeah, I think this has very strange, if not curious, application.
Yeah. Because really easy to point to money as the first thing. Obviously, we all need it. As I said earlier, we spend, probably about a quarter of our lives or more thinking about money. So there is that aspect. But are we thinking about money in light of what we need to set ourselves up for retirement? Or potentially, what can we be doing with that money for God's kingdom now? For other things, our possessions, the people in our lives and so on. Are we investing in everything? What do you do with your time? How much time do you dedicate to the things of God? It's a rhetorical question, so no one's going to really feel very comfortable answering that. Because don't we all say that we would like to be devoting more and more time to the things of God, yet when we leave church on a Sunday, we get back to work and those things consume us and, oh yeah, I've got a job to do, I've got a mortgage to pay and so on. But think about it, even the spare time that you've got, even throughout the day, how much do you dedicate with your time, your money, your resources to invest in family, in people within the church, but even reaching others with the gospel? Because there's this implication here that we buy friends, not that we're using money to buy people into the kingdom of heaven, but how are we using those resources God gives us to invest in those within the church, but then to take the gospel to a lost world? This is probably where it's really hard-hitting, isn't it? How do we convert these earthly resources for an eternal reward? Because at the end of the day, that's precisely what Christ is going to test us on when we stand before him one day to give an account. And this is where he says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into eternal dwellings. So he drives this home, looking in verse 13, that no servant can serve 2 masters, for either will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. Why can't we serve both God and money? Can't we just say, yep, I'm a Christian, but I need money to do stuff.
It's a hard issue, so it's all totally interlinked. Our dedication to Christ, so our resources are not our own, so it is totally all one.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like this rich young ruler all over again. What do you love? Oh, I keep your law, I do everything you say, God. And God said, give me money. Okay, I can't do that. So it shows you what we truly love. So that's what it's about. If God knocks on your door and says, I want everything you have, are you willing to give it? And if you're not willing to give it, then clearly you don't love God.
Yep.
It's not that money is evil, it's what do you love?
So Jesus says in Luke 12, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Do we really see our treasure as being in heaven or right here, right now? So just in some time we've got, why don't we kick around some ideas? If you think about our time, our money, and our resources, what are some ways that we could put those things to use right here, right now, to see an eternal reward one day? Thoughts?
Let me start us off. If I put it in context of the parable, this man was aiming, he wanted friends. We all want friends. We all want associations. And his comfort was going to be found in his friends to receive him, who can then provide for him. Jesus flips that and says, well, invest in people, because love God will love, you will love others. Invest in people so that then when you enter heaven, they will receive you. It's quite amazing the link that he makes with regards to our investment of God's resources in people for the gospel's sake. So it's not just simply let's help everyone and everyone. We just can't do that. But it's a key link to gospel, because they're going to receive you in heaven. Therefore, they need to receive the gospel, and ultimately the use of our money with our resources to help them physically should also always be coupled with the need to help them spiritually. And by our actual tangible resources being used, they will welcome us in heaven. I mean, it's quite remarkable, the connection he makes, and are we so eager to do that? So just making that clear connection.
Yeah. Thoughts? So how?
So you pay your taxes, because God commands us to pay our taxes.
Yeah.
And then the wealth you have left, you look after your family, you feed and clothe, the basics. And then you give sacrificially and joyfully to the church and the works of God, and there are many. Suffering church, etc. So there's lots of charities you can give to. And then having that balance where you do have enough time to spend time with God, and not pursuing all your time, filling it with trying to make this money dwell into His kingdom, because that's a bit pointless.
Yeah.
If you don't spend time with Him.
I almost feel guilty to play the cash card. If you go to the parable of the talents, Logan buried it. He got a significant rev up. The other two, I'll use the word punted. They took a risk. Yeah, so I'm wondering what risks I'm taking. And what risks do I take with my children, for example, in the eternal context? What do I do with my money here in the here and now context? And I don't want to go anywhere particular, but there's two quite grey-haired people, more so than myself, in the room. I wonder what their reflections are. And the lady sitting over here, I don't know, what are your reflections on life in this context? I'm fascinated, because when older people are asked if they have time over again, what they do is what I read from time to time, they take more risks. So I'm not wanting to put anyone on the spot, but what's rattling?
Anyone, feel free to answer that.
Just open dialogue. Risk. God wants us to take a risk with friends, with family, with cash. That's how I read the parable of the talents. But I don't know if it's not comfortable, don't respond. But It's just a question of thought for two people in particular in the room.
Yeah.
Well, my view of this parable anyway is Jesus ends with the idea that you've got to hate one against the other. And I think as a Christian, this is the principle that we should have. We hate the things of sin, the things that are going to lead us away from God, and we should love the righteousness of Christ, which is ours. We possess it, and our life should be a statement that we love Christ and the things of Christ. We know we're righteous in Him, and then we hate those things that take us away, whatever they might be. Because Jesus is looking at the Pharisees now and He says, look, they loved money. Look at their lives. And His disciples are listening to Him and hearing what He's saying about all this management business, and He's realizing that, we do live our lives with this view that we need to hate the things that are driving us away from Christ and love Him. I reckon this parable basically is a statement on that myself. So how we judge every step, like the gentleman has been saying, what we do with our money and our time and everything else, then if we hate the things of the world and we love the things of God, we will know what to do with our family, we'll know what to do with our children and our money, and the rest of the Bible gives us lots and lots of steps as how we ought to live our lives and how we ought to think about this, that and the other. But this parable is really saying, to love one against the other and to conduct our lives in that view. How can I do this if I hate the things that I know it will lead to? And Paul says, there's certain things that he loves to do, but he doesn't do them. And other things he doesn't want to do, but he does it. And there's a conflict. But he's really saying, what we do, we do what is right according to the scriptures and be motivated by that.
Yeah. So I guess in closing, that's the key takeaway. Jesus set out to here, and the passage we looked at last week. This is really a conversation about how we're using our resources, our time and money with an eternity focus. Every day, maybe we think like Jonathan Edwards did, God, stamp eternity on my eyeballs. Let's look at everything in light of what God expects of us.